The term absorption of overheads refers to the process of including the overhead cost in the product cost. And we yesterday understood the concept of overhead absorption rate. Now, the overhead absorption rate was calculated as budgeted overheads upon budgeted output. And let's, and that was the starting point of estimating a rate at the very beginning. Okay, estimating a rate at the very beginning of the year because budgets are prepared at the beginning of the year. Uh, that specific point focused on what is what is that specific rate that we are going to use to include overheads in the product cost. Now let's understand two terms called under absorption and over absorption of overheads, and let's also understand a couple of accounting entries associated with it. These are more from a costing perspective, but whenever the term over or under absorption of overheads is used at the skill level, at the PM level, you should not spend you should not be required to look around when the term over and under absorption of overheads are used. So let's understand how that works. Okay, so absorption of overheads, the process for including the overhead cost in the cost of product is called absorption of overheads. The process for including the overhead cost in the cost of product is called absorption of overheads. And overhead absorption rate is basically budgeted overheads upon budgeted output. Now, today we'll understand that this formula also can be tweaked to apply to a specific circumstance. Now, the OAR, that is the overhead absorption rate, is calculated at the beginning of the year. Okay, now what the management's intention is, see, overhead absorption rate or these calculations, they are not entering your, they are not directly entering rather your financial accounting records. The management accounting data is for management to make internal decisions. It is for management to arrive at certain conclusions. What happens in case of overheads is, because the management wants to estimate the cost of the product, it wants to calculate the break even point, it wants to make certain assumptions and see at every stage whether the product is profitable or not. And these micro aspects of costing, what the business entity does is at the very beginning of the year they calculate an overhead absorption rate. Now say for example the budgeted output is 2,40,000 units, and the budgeted overheads are, say, 36 lakhs. So my overhead absorption rate, which is basically budgeted overheads upon budgeted output, so 36 lakh upon 2,40,000. What will that give you? It will give me a number of 15 per unit. So this is the rate at which the overhead cost should be included in the product cost. Okay. So this is the rate at which the overhead cost should be included in product cost. And this number is calculated at the start of the year. Okay. Now Okay, now let us assume that the business entity has a monthly closing process. Let us assume that the business entity has a monthly closing process and budgeted annual output is 2,40,000. So budgeted monthly output is naturally 2,40,000 upon 12, that is 20,000. So what the business entity does is at the start of first month, monthly closing hai matlab what they do is they calculate the results and the performance at the end of each month, and they also calculate the financial position, assets, liabilities, debtors, and everything. They close the details for that month and then they move on to the next month. At the start of first month, the following entry is recorded. So what is this entry? So right now there is a budgeted spend that is going to happen. Okay. And budgeted monthly output is 20,000. By uh, overhead control account debit to provision for overheads. Why provision? Because this is the start of the month. We have not yet incurred or paid anything. So you will record an entry overhead control account debit to provision for overheads, which this is your budgeted number. Okay, my budgeted number will be 20,000 units into 15, that is 3 lakh. This is the entry that I record at the beginning of the month. Now, let's also write one more thing, that this entry is done assuming that output will be 20,000 and overhead absorption rate is 15 per unit. This is done at the beginning of the month. Okay, now at the end of the month, the business entity found out that actual production was 21,000 units. Budgeted OAR is 15 per unit. Okay, now what the business entity will do is, now what it wants to do is it wants to include the cost in the product, overhead cost, it wants to include in the product. So it wants to absorb overheads at 15 per unit, that is 21,000 units into 15 per unit. Itna ho jayega? The amount will be 21,000 into 15, that is 3,15,000. Okay, it wants to absorb overheads at 15 per unit. So this is the amount it thinks ideally should be incurred. But overheads incurred are 3,17,000. Overheads incurred are 3,17,000. So absorbed 3,15,000, incurred 3,17,000. So absorbed is less than incurred. This situation is called under absorption of overheads. And if absorbed is greater than incurred, It is called over absorption of overheads. So if the overheads absorbed are less than the overheads incurred, that is called under absorption of overheads. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to now record this particular entry, but with 3,15,000 units in mind. So my overhead control account will go, how will this be calculated? 21,000 into 15 and 21,000 into 15. Overhead control account debit to provision for overheads. And ultimately, you know that if I'm using the absorption costing method, this overhead will get added to product cost. So ultimately, ये किसमें add होने वाला है? This is going to get added to inventory. Now the actual overheads incurred are more, right? You have incurred 3,17,000. So 2,000 extra, that will be the actual cost of this particular unit. तो आपके दो columns बनेंगे. There will be budgeted, there will be actual. And yesterday, if you remember, we did fixed budget, we did adjusted fixed budget, जिसको we called flexed budget, and we also did flexible budget yesterday. So 3 lakh, the amount of 3 lakh, 20,000 into 15, that is as per the fixed budget. 21,000 into 15, 21,000 is the actual output. So budgeted figures adjusted for the actual output is your flexed budget, and then the under or over absorption is basically now a step towards getting to the final figures for actual cost in your costing records. So, the discussion on under or over absorption of overheads, you will not get a question specifically dedicated to this, but in a question you will often have the term under or over absorption of overheads thrown at you, and at that point you should not be confused कि ये under or over absorption का meaning क्या है. आपके financial accounting records में incurred is going to go. Okay, in your financial accounting records the actual amount incurred is going to go. Even in your cost accounting records, there will be a separate absorption related column, there will be a separate incurred column, and there you will also be doing variance analysis. That will come in much later, but the term under or over absorption is basically are used to understand whether you have absorbed overheads in excess or you have under absorbed the overheads. And how to calculate overheads absorbed, let me write it here. How to calculate overheads absorbed. This is very simple. This is actual output into predetermined overhead absorption rate. Actual output into predetermined overhead absorption rate. This is how the numbers are calculated. So this predetermined OAR is determined at the beginning of the year. The overheads are incurred throughout the year. At the end of the year or at the end of the month, you do a comparative variance analysis, and that should ideally prompt you to maybe revise the standards or maybe take a corrective control action. See, it's not always the problem that something has gone wrong on the execution front. It might happen that the standards you have set were faulty. Maybe the standards that you had set were in accordance with certain older data, and now the efficiency levels and the number of working hours maybe have changed. So the standards themselves might be incorrect. So that is something which the process of management accounting, costing, performance management helps you to understand. It is not just corrective action. Sometimes you have to go back and bring about changes at the planning level itself. Now, I'm sure when you did the subject of management accounting at the knowledge level, or you must have done costing in some form or the other at your university level, the terms under and over absorption of overheads by themselves would have been discussed. Okay, so Any doubts that you have, please let me know right now. और बाद में भी बता सकते हो, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, but better if you can tell me right now. Anything?
Yes, just about the markup and margin that you wanted to remind.
Yes, yes. I will be taking up the markup and margin part right now before we venture into the actual discussion on costing. So, the margin markup discussion again, I'm sure it must have happened in some form or the other at, your FR, FM, FA, MA. It is a part of a lot of discussions, but let's revisit it because in some question or the other, when the word margin and markup come up, I don't want you guys to spend time recollecting what that is. Let's get to margin and markup. Now, in estimating the sales price of a particular item, how is the sales price of an item calculated? The sales price is usually cost of goods sold plus a certain amount of gross profit. Okay. Or rather, what is gross profit? Let's look at it from this angle. Gross profit is sales minus cost of goods sold. Okay. Now, cost of goods sold is opening stock plus purchases plus closing stock. I'm not getting into that. What is margin? Okay. So, when gross profit is expressed as a percentage of sales, it is called margin. When gross profit is expressed as a percentage of sales, it is called margin. So, if sales are 100 and and profit margin is 20%, then gross profit equal to 20% of 100, that is 20, and cost of sales will be 100 minus 20, that is 80. What is markup? When gross profit is expressed as a percentage of cost, it is called markup. When gross profit is expressed as a percentage of cost, it is called markup. So if if cost is, say, if cost is 100, markup is 25%, then sales value will be 100, that is cost, plus 25% of 100, that is profit, which will give me 125, that is sales. So there are people out there who will try to, put it across in the form of an equation. But whenever the words margin and markup are given, I prefer, instead of, going by equation, I prefer expressing everything in terms of 100 first and then calculating the actual selling price or whatever it is. Now, for example, the markup is 25%. Markup is 25%. Okay. Selling price of an item is 200. calculate gross profit. Okay, so how do we go about it? What I always prefer doing is I prefer making two columns, one assumed column and one actual column. Now they have given us markup. Okay, they have not given us margin. Cost 100. Markup is calculated as a percentage of cost and markup is 25%. So this is markup and 100 plus 25, 125. Okay, now selling price of an item is 200. They want me to calculate the gross profit. If selling price is 200, in front of which number should I write it? In front of 100, in front of 25, or in front of 125? Ideally, I should write it here. They have asked me to calculate gross profit. How will I do it? 200 into 25 upon 125. This is my cross multiplication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 40 equal to 200 into 25 upon 125. And now I can of course calculate cost. 160, see 40 is 25% of 160, so it fits in. Anytime margin or markup is given, don't be lazy. Write it down, assumed column, actual column, and give the headings. Now, see, nobody is judging you. The only thing that is happening right is you are getting the correct answer. So, give it the adequate amount of time. Spend 10 seconds, making these two columns, and you will get your answer quickly instead of, getting the answer wrong. Don't trust your calculations in the exam. Always write it down so that you know exactly the numbers that you have calculated. You don't need to double check also. Okay, just have a look at this once. Chalo. With this in mind, let's now progress to the next part of the discussion, which is now the actual part of performance management, which is the first topic, specialist cost accounting techniques. Now, as times evolved, as businesses evolved, they realized that a blanket overhead absorption rate, which is calculated using the which is calculated using budgeted overheads upon budgeted output, might not always give you the answer that you are looking for. What does that mean? It will not help you to accurately estimate the total cost of a particular item. Now, what happens is if you use overhead absorption rate formula in the form of budgeted overheads upon budgeted output, what you are indirectly saying is that the expenses incurred depend only on the number of units produced, and that might not be the case. The overheads incurred will not depend on the number of units produced. They might depend on a whole lot of other things also. For example, if the overheads are delivery charges, then in that case they don't depend upon the number of units produced. Suppose I am talking about delivering goods to my customer. There is a customer whose location is 5 kilometers away, and there is a customer whose location is 20 kilometers away. The overhead cost incurred for customer 1 will be lesser as compared to the overhead transportation cost incurred for customer 2, because customer 2 is situated farther away. So naturally, if you use the number of units produced as the basis for, all your calculations, naturally those calculations are uh, not going to be enough. Those calculations will have their own faults, and estimation of product cost will definitely take a hit once again. So, you need to find out a way, you need to find out a technique which will basically help you to correctly determine the cost of a particular product. Now, one of the many techniques that can be used in this situation is known as the activity based costing technique. What the activity based costing technique does is, it says we will not use number of units produced as the base for calculating the absorption of overheads. We'll come up with more efficient, we'll come up with more accurate ways of doing so. And how do they intend to do that? They intend to find out in this particular method, you they intend to find out to make 1 unit of the final product, or to do this. But when you are talking about a particular cost, they try to find out what drives this cost, what influences this cost. And once they know the influencer, they can correctly make an estimate. They can make a studied estimate, what we call as a guesstimate, of the amount of overheads that should be allocated to each and every, that should be absorbed into each and every product. Now, yesterday, say for example, I'm talking about a premises where I'm running 4 classes and there are 4 classrooms. Now, one way of dividing the cost, if I want to calculate, there are 4 classrooms. Classroom 1, uh 10 standard classes happening, classroom 2, 12 standard classes happening, classroom 3, ACCA class, classroom 4, some other class. I want to calculate the cost of teaching students in a particular class. So what I do is, 1 lakh is the rent, I divide it by 4, and I say 25, 25, 25, 25, and I include it in the cost of providing the service. Is it correct? Well, only partially. The amount of rent depends upon the space that is given to you on rent. Like this house that I'm living in, if it is around say 400 square feet or 500 square feet, then it will have a particular rent. But if I move into a smaller apartment, why is the rent lesser for a 1 BHK as compared to a 2 BHK? Because the space, the square foot area of a 1 BHK apartment is smaller. So naturally, it is very clear that the rent expense depends upon the square foot area. So the driver of rent cost is not the number of classrooms, but it is the square foot area occupied by each classroom. The influencer for my overall transportation cost is not the number of units produced, it is the distance you are covering for delivering that particular item. Now, say, let us assume that you're talking about uh, machine repair cost or annual maintenance charges. Naturally, the machine that has more frequent maintenance schedules will demand more cost. So, in that case, the if you want to calculate the actual repair and maintenance or AMC charges to be apportioned and absorbed, you should not use the number of machines as your base, but you should consider how many times does the maintenance activity take place. That will become the influencer for cost. And this item which influences the cost is known as a cost driver. Why cost driver? Because it drives the calculation of cost. It impacts the calculation of cost. It influences the calculation of cost. This is your basic idea about what is a cost driver. And there is another term that we are going to look at, that is called a cost pool. A cost pool is an activity that consumes resources and for which overhead costs are identified and allocated. So, with respect to, say, delivery charges, what could be your cost pool? The petrol amount that you pay, the amount that you pay to the driver or the rider, all of these together will be considered as a cost pool, because a cost pool is an activity that consumes resources. So for which, the runner boy cost, to that you will add the petrol charges, that together is your cost pool. And what is your cost driver? Your cost driver is your distance covered, because the amount that you pay to the runner boy and the amount that you paid for petrol will both depend upon the distance covered. You must have seen this in Zomato also. When you place an order, if an item is coming from far away, they charge you more. If an item is coming from close by, maybe the delivery fee is also waived off it. So it is very clear that delivery charges don't depend upon the. See, if you're ordering one cake or you're ordering 10 cakes, the delivery charges here are more influenced by the distance that has to be traveled, less influenced by the number of units to be delivered. Complex cost units are not a part of your PM syllabus, because if somebody orders 100 cakes, then you can't ship it on a two-wheeler. You will have to probably take a small tempo for making delivery of 100 cakes. So in that case, the number of units delivered will also be a driver. But in your performance management syllabus, complex cost drivers are not there. So costs which are influenced by two items will not be tested in the exam. So that is where the idea of uh, overhead absorption rate or modified overhead absorption rate comes from here. That the number of units produced is not always the cost influencer, it is influenced by other items also. Now, yesterday we looked at one situation where we said कि एक counselor है. There is one counselor, and what is his job? He gives advice to students in a particular batch. Now, let's assume that this counselor's salary is 80,000. If I want to distribute the counselor's salary in the four batches, I can do 80,000 upon 4, but that would be incorrect because that doesn't actually reflect the correct application of his time. If the BT class has 40 students and if the FA class has 80 students, naturally it will be assumed that he spends more time in the FA class, less time in the BT class. So the share of his salary apportioned to the FA class naturally should be more. But then we were still contemplating and we thought that instead of number of students, if you actually want to do the correct distribution of cost, what you should do is you should distribute the cost not on the basis of number of students. You should do that on the basis of the time spent in each class. So what you will ideally do is you will calculate the time spent by the counselor in each of the classes. Then you will use that as the base for cost distribution, cost apportionment. So here the time spent in that particular class is the cost driver, and this approach of apportionment of overheads helps you to better estimate the cost of the final product or service. And it is not driven by number of units produced, it is driven by it matlab the overhead calculation, not anything else. The overhead calculation is governed by what? The overhead calculation is governed by these cost drivers, cost influencers, which are now not linked to the output, they are linked to the activities that are performed. Delivery is an activity, maintenance is an activity, counseling is an activity. Hence, this method of costing is known as activity based costing. Okay, so now I want you to have a look at this example. We have discussed this just now. I just want you to go through it once. Okay. Tell me once you're done and you want me to scroll, I'll scroll accordingly.
For me, you can scroll, sir, if everyone is ready.
This topic that we are going to do is going to be one of the questions in section A or in section B. Specialist cost accounting techniques is not tested in section C. ACCA has given a guidance note on that they will not test this topic in section C. We will definitely take up some questions for this purpose, uh, but we'll not we'll do that for concept building, but it will not be tested in the exam section C में, but the concept of course is going to be tested everywhere. Okay, chalo. Two basic terms, cost pool and cost driver. We have discussed these as well. Just have a look at it. Cost driver is an influencer of cost. You guys will understand the term influencer better than anything else. So, okay. Now, the activity-based costing approach, as we discussed just now, depends on the cost drivers, basically items that influence cost. Now, I have taken another example. Say, suppose we are talking of a Domino's outlet. Let us check what all overhead costs are incurred. Maintenance cost and depreciation of machinery. Now, depreciation of machinery, I'm sure when you did your FR paper, there used to be an adjustment in the additional information that depreciation should be included in cost of sales. Why? When would depreciation be included in cost of sales or cost of production, first of all, to begin with, is when the depreciation relates to a production machinery. Only when depreciation relates to the production machinery will that depreciation cost be included in the cost of production. Now it makes sense to absorb these costs on the basis of number of machine hours used. Say there are four types of pizzas that are made: margherita, cheese burst, farm fresh, and chicken. And you know the number of hours required on the machine, and then you can calculate the machine cost absorbed. But there are other overhead costs as well, like rent of premises, salary of the security guard. In absorption costing, even these would be absorbed using machine hour basis. But that approach would be wrong because the rent of premises has got absolutely zero connection with the number of hours for which the machine was running. The salary of the security guy does not depend upon the number of units produced. So you will have to find out the most appropriate way of calculating the cost. ABC overcomes this problem by not using a generic item like machine hours for absorption. Instead, it uses cost pools to group the costs which are driven by an activity. So, cost pool is basically a collection of costs which are required, collection of all the cost heads which are required for a particular specific activity. What do I mean by that? For example, if I am saying ki I'm talking about the delivery cost. Delivery cost is the petrol charges you have to pay plus the amount that you have to pay to runner guys. Maintenance cost could also include the amount of repair and maintenance work done, the oiling that has to be done, the the amount of opportunity cost sometimes that you will have to consider because the machine was stopped for that particular duration. All of these will depend upon the number of times maintenance was done. So when I'm talking about cost pools, these are all related items which are grouped together for, costing purposes because they are connected to one activity, and the cost driver is the influencer of cost for that particular activity. Now, the cost of order processing might be related to the number of orders dispatched or to the weight of the items dispatched. One second, guys. Your traditional systems will unfortunately, the normal absorption costing system, the traditional way of absorption costing would always use the number of units produced as the base. But in activity based costing, you come to a realization that not everything is influenced by the uh, number of units produced. There are multiple ways in which costs are determined, costs are influenced, and hence that is the correct way for determining the overheads to be absorbed per unit. Now, the old seed, even Activity based costing is what? Activity based costing is modified absorption costing. Well, absorption costing is a method in which you also include the fixed overheads in the overall product cost, right? Absorption costing is a way of including fixed overheads in the product cost. So, activity based costing is also a way of including fixed overheads in product cost. It's just that the way fixed overheads ka calculation is done, that calculation approach is different. So you should not say difference between activity based costing and absorption costing, because activity based costing is a way of doing absorption costing. You should say activity based costing method versus the traditional method. Okay, so just have a look at the points. We have discussed all of these points right now. I just want you to read these ones before we move on to the next discussion. Minimum 1 to 2 questions in your paper you can definitely expect from, no, actually not 1 to 2, 6 to 8 marks in your paper will come from specialist cost accounting techniques. From an examination perspective, very, very important. Okay. Yes, Abu, tell me.
Oh, sir, in exam they will specifically ask us to calculate this based on traditional approach as well.
No, no. We look at the questions now. Don't worry. I'll tell you what kind of questions are asked. We'll do ample practice.
Okay, so thank you. Slightly scroll down, sir.
Okay, chalo. Now, how is activity-based costing done? Instead of looking at the steps first, we'll do two questions and then we'll spend time in understanding. Then we'll build the working. On the basis of that working, we'll build everything else backwards. Let's not have a look at the steps and, kill the creativity. Have a look at this question. Okay, always read the requirement first. Using ABC, calculate the full production cost per unit and the profit per unit for each product. Comment on the implications of the figures calculated. Now, they have asked you to calculate full production cost and profit, which means the overheads have to be absorbed. Kushal, a chocolate manufacturer, produces three products: the Sky Bar, a bar of solid milk chocolate, the Moon Egg, and the Sun Bar. There are three types of products they are making. The direct labor cost per unit, direct material cost per unit, actual production or sales is given, direct labor hours are given, direct machine hours per unit, and selling price per unit. Annual production overhead is 80,000. Breakup of cost: machining cost, component cost, setup cost, packing cost. Okay, actual production or sales that have happened, they have given that. Then they have given machine hours per unit, number of production setups, number of components, and number of customer orders. So, using activity based costing, calculate the full production cost per unit. Now, they have given you the total production overheads and they have given you the breakup of cost. Under the traditional approach to cost calculation, what you would have done is you would have divided the total budgeted overheads divided by the budgeted output, which is 5 lakh plus 150 plus 250. You would have calculated an overhead absorption rate and you would have applied that to all the items together. Here, what you are going to do is they have given you a split of the cost. Okay, they have given you a split of individual cost. What we'll have to do is we'll have to first of all identify what are the different activities and then connect those with the cost drivers. Okay, so as a first step, if you observe here, there is machine related activity happening. Then there are some components which are being supplied. This is not direct material, by the way. Otherwise, it will not be a part of overheads. Then setup costs are given. Setup cost is, every time you set up a particular machine, maybe you have to clean something up, you have to make a production schedule, you have to do oiling, and all of these things. So these are machine setup costs. And then you have parking cost. सॉरी पैकिंग कॉस्ट चश्मा नहीं पहना तो देखो क्या होता है रीडिंग इट एज पैकिंग ओके पैकिंग कॉस्ट सो दे हैव गिवन यू द ब्रेकअप ऑफ ओवरहेड्स ठीक है सो द फर्स्ट स्टेप दैट यू शुड डू इज इन दिस journey the first step that you should do is identify the activities involved identify the activities involved. What are the activities? There are four, I think. The first one is machining. The second one is what? Component is not an activity. Maybe it is called usage of components. Yeah, aisa kuch name you will have to give. Then setup. The activity is doing machine setups. And packing the material is another activity. So step one, identify the activities involved. What should be your step two? Step two is identify the cost drivers. Identify the cost drivers. That is factors that influence cost. Okay, this is my step two. So identify cost drivers for each activity. That is what causes these activity costs to be incurred. So let's write down activity and let's write down cost driver. If my activity is machining, then machine hours per unit might be the most appropriate cost driver. So cost driver will be machine hours. Okay, then activity is usage of components. This must be some indirect material or something else that is instrumental in production, though not the material. So it will be usage of components के लिए number of components. Number of components is the cost driver. Then activity is doing machine setups. Okay, machine setups will depend upon the number of production setups. So cost driver is number of production setups. And last one is packing. What is the cost influencer? The cost influencer is number of customer orders. That will decide the total packing cost that you incur. So this is number of customer orders. Okay, so I could make this table to identify the cost drivers, that is the cost influencer. Basically, what is cost influenced by? Step 1, identify the activity. Step 2, identify the cost driver. Now the third step is calculate a cost driver rate for each activity. The cost driver rate is calculated in the same way as the absorption costing traditional OAR, but a separate cost driver base will be calculated for each activity. So what we'll be doing is now we'll be setting up a detailed working. Step 3, calculate cost driver rate for each activity. Okay, so we are going to write down first of all the name of the cost pool, which is already given to us. Then we do have our cost driver, followed by total budgeted cost. Okay, cost pool, these four. Cost driver, these four. Okay. Now just write down the total budgeted cost. Okay. The total budgeted cost will come here. And after that, what you are going to do is you are now going to get a cost driver, or we'll now understand how to use the cost drivers. Just give me a moment. Okay. So this is my total budgeted cost. Now I need, see, I have my cost driver. How do I calculate my overhead absorption rate? Overhead absorption rate for me is budgeted cost divided by the cost driver units, right? So now I need the cost driver unit. If machine hours are my cost driver, I will need the total machine hours. And how will I get the total machine hours? Let's do a simple calculation here, which is calculation of total budgeted machine hours. I have units, machine hours per unit. ठीक है. So 5 lakh into 5 lakh units into 0.01. Okay. 5 lakh units into 0.01. Then 1,50,000 units into, sorry, 1,50,000 units into 0.04. So 1,50,000 units into 0.04, and the last one is how much? 2,50,000 into 0.02. How much is this going to be? 5 lakh into 0.01 plus 1,50,000 into 0.04 plus 2,50,000 into 0.02, 16,000. Cost driver units are important because ultimately I need to calculate my overhead absorption rate. Okay, now component cost. The cost driver is number of components. Is there a way to calculate the number of components? Yes. Number of components for Skybar are 4, number of components for Moon Egg are 6, and number of components for Sunbar are 20. Now please pay attention to the choice of words. They have not written number of components per unit. They have mentioned number of components. So you will have to do 4 plus 6 plus 20. Don't do 5 lakh into 4, 1 lakh into 1 lakh 50 into 1. No. Why? Because the statement doesn't say per unit. It just says number of components. So next thing is calculation of number of components. 4 plus 6 plus 20. That is 30. I'm just going to write a small note here. The question says number of components. Okay, the question says number of components. It does not say number of components per unit or something like that. Therefore, do not multiply the output with the component number. So this is one thing you have to be careful about. Okay, so your denominator here is 30. 16,000, then it is 30. For setup cost, you have the number of production setups 3, 1, and 26. The number of production setups are 3, 1, and 26. Okay, so number of three plus 1 plus 26. Again, that is 30, right? So your denominator is 30 here. Now I'll also tell you how to express the cost, don't worry. And packing is number of customer orders. So number of customer orders. How is that calculated? 21 plus 4 plus 25. Sorry. So now you have total budgeted cost, you have cost driver units. Now let us express the overhead absorption rate. Overhead absorption rate. How are you going to do this? You are going to do 5,000 upon 16,000, which is 0.31. But what is 0.31? 0.31 per machine hour. Okay. Then 15,000 upon 30 is 500. But what is 500? 500 per component. 30,000 upon 30. 30,000 upon 30. That is 1,000. 1,000 for what? 1,000 per production setup. And 30,000 upon 50. What will you get? You will get 600. But what is 600? 600 per order. Okay. So let me just complete the table. You will soon realize that I have a problem, and the name of this problem is formatting का OCD है. Unless I get that format and everything right ना, मुझे खाना हजम नहीं होता है. हाँ. Now this looks doable. I have my overhead absorption rate. I have calculated the cost driver rate for each activity. And what is the next step? The next step is absorb the activity cost into product. Step 4, absorb the activity cost into product. So let's go item wise. Particulars, sky bar, moon, egg, and sun bar. Moon, egg, and sun bar. Okay. And now you have to do it for each individual product. You have to calculate the overhead cost to be absorbed. Okay. So let's do that. A, units produced. One second now. Now it's better. So what are the units produced? 5 lakh, 1 lakh 50,000, 2 lakh 50,000. 5 lakh, 1 lakh 50,000, 2 lakh 50,000. Then you have number of units produced. Now you have to start with every single cost item. Let's go with the machining cost first. So I will need machine hours per unit. Okay. Machine hours per unit. कैसे होगा? Machine hours per unit is given to you 0.01, 0.04, 0.02. 0.01, 0.02 ही है ना? Sorry, 0.04 and 0.02. Now I'll get total machine hours, which will be A units produced into B machine hours per unit. 5 lakh into 0.01. You already have the total with you. A, B, C, D. D will be overhead absorption rate calculated in step 3. कितना है ओवरहेड अब्जॉर्प्शन रेट 0.31 पर मशीन आर 0.31 then machining cost absorbed which is C that is total machine hours, into D, that is overhead absorption rate. 5000 into 0.31 total. So in this case, what you have to do is, see, 0.31 is the rounded off number. Ideally, what you should do here is, instead of writing 0.31, you should write 5000 upon 16,000. It will give you better values. Okay, so 5000 upon 16,000. I'll just increase the number of decimals so that you can see this for what it is. Now you have machining cost absorbed. The best way to check this is take the total. If the total matches, then great. If it doesn't match, then naturally there is some problem with your calculation. Okay, you have done machine cost absorbed. Maybe, I'll put it in a separate color so that, this is your focus point. Okay, now you had units produced. Now let's go to the second item, which is the component cost. Okay, so we'll write down in row number F, we'll write down number of components, which is 4, 6, and 20. 4, 6, and 20. Okay, now what is the cost per component? 300. Overhead absorption rate calculated above. So take this. OAR calculated in step 3. What is the cost per component? 500, 500, 500. So now I will get my total component cost, which is F into G. This will be 4 into 500. Don't worry, I'll remove the decimals. It gets, if the formula is, if the pattern is inconsistent, it looks bad. This is my total component cost. What is my ultimate objective? My ultimate objective is I need the, what do I need? Full production cost per unit. Okay. I need the full production cost per unit. Material labor को बाद में मैं add कर दूंगा. Now setup cost. Okay. I have the number of production setups 3, 1 and 26. I. Number of production setups 3, 1, 26. ठीक है. Number of production setups 3, 1 and 26. And what is the cost driver? What is cost per production setup? 1000. So write that down. OAR calculated in step 3. Cost per production setup. So total production setup cost. This is I into J. Then number of customer orders. ये दिया है आपको number of customer orders and you have the cost per order. So write that down. Number of customer orders 21, 4 and 25. M. What is M? द कॉस्ट पर ऑर्डर। ठीक है, यहां पे लिखो कॉस्ट पर ऑर्डर कितना था, 500 था ना, सॉरी 600 था। So OAR calculated in step 3, 600. Total, what is the name? Total packing cost. यहाँ पे लिखो total packing cost, L into M. Okay. So another item, N, total packing cost. Now you have four costs: machining cost, component cost, total production cost, total packing cost. Now let's take the total of each of these. These are basically my production overheads. So total production overheads, E plus H plus K plus N. Okay, I have my total production overheads. Now I have my material and labor cost also given to me, which is 0.07 and 0.17, direct labor cost per unit, direct material cost per unit. So let's now get into the calculation mode. What they have asked me is calculate the full production cost per unit and the profit per unit. I have total production overheads, LMNOP ठीक है, my total production units कितना होगा मेरा total production units for this particular item, 5 lakh. What I'll have after this is I will have production overheads per unit. How will I get that? O upon P. Okay, now R and S. R is material cost per unit. S is labor cost per unit. Material cost per unit 0.17, 0.19, and 0.16. 0.16. Labor cost also you can take it here. I have overheads, I have material, I have labor. I can now very easily calculate my total production cost per unit. What will this be? This will be Q plus R plus S. Okay, now they have also asked you to calculate the profit per unit. So let's write down selling price per unit. Is it given to us at any point? 0.5, 0.45, 0.43. U, that is selling price per unit, minus T, that is total production cost. You see, uh, in product, in the third product, we are making a loss per unit. Okay, just have a look at the working ones. Absorb the activity cost into product. Have a look at this working and tell me, go step by step and tell me if you want me to explain something again.
In this step, since we don't have budgeted cost, that's why there is no concept of over or under absorption right now, sir.
I beg your pardon?
In this problem, since we don't have the budgeted cost, the production overhead costs, there is
Mm-hmm.
no concept of over or under
Yeah,
absorption,
yeah. This
sir.
is a simple calculation question, nothing related to under or over absorption here.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Understood, sir.
Okay, just look at the final one. Now, this was one part of the question where they wanted you to use the activity-based costing approach, which we did. Now, there is another part of the question where they are saying a comment on the implications of the figures calculated. Now, basically, if you want to comment on something, ideally, what you should do is you should compare this with the traditional absorption costing approach. Okay, so you have direct material, direct labor given. The overhead apportionment should ideally be done, in a straightforward manner. So let's see if we can use the traditional absorption costing approach and what do we arrive at. Okay, so now this is calculation of cost using traditional absorption costing approach. Again, A, B, C, D. So this has to be material cost per unit, labor cost per unit, which is directly here. Okay, material cost and labor cost per unit is given to you. Then now I'll need my total So here, instead of having a overhead absorption rate that is, given per unit, sorry, that is, calculated on the basis of the activity, here I'll have to take an overall overhead absorption rate calculated on another basis. Basically, we could use machine hours as the basis for everything. Here, my annual production overheads was 80,000. Because all of these are manufactured in a machine, we could take the total machine hours as the basis. So what are the total machine hours? 16,000. Okay. So uh, overhead absorption rate is budgeted overheads upon budgeted machine hours. Usually in absorption costing, machine hours is taken as the base. So what would your overhead absorption rate be? 80,000 upon 16,000. That is 5 per machine hour. है ना? It will be 5 per machine hour. Now let's write down machine hours per unit. Do we have machine hours per unit? Yes, we do. So, and we also have an OAR. OAR, that is overhead absorption rate per machine hour. कितना है? 5. Now, overhead per unit. How much will that be? C, that is machine hours per unit, into D, that is overhead absorption rate. 0.01 into 5, 0.05, 0.20. This way. Now, can you arrive at the total cost per unit? Of course, you can. A plus B plus E. Okay. Now, G, selling price per unit. This is given in the question. H. H is profit per unit, which will be G minus F. Now, if you observe these numbers, you will have to contrast two things, okay? You will have to look at this profit per unit and you will have to look at this profit per unit. Look at both. And now this should help you to make a better, what have they asked you? Comment on the implications of the figures calculated. Here, the cost per unit is 0.29, 0.22, 0.53, 0.39. So basically, when you are making these kind of comments, you should have a basis to compare the results of activity-based costing with something. And this is that base. Using absorption costing technique, all overheads were absorbed using machine hours. In activity-based costing, we have done it in a more scientific, calculated, precise manner. And under traditional absorption costing methods, cost per unit and profit are calculated, and it might lead to conclude that moon egg is the less profitable or the product not worth producing. But activity based costing, which is a more scientific method, will help you to realize that it is the sun bar which should not be produced, not the moon egg. Okay, so these are some comments that we can make about the three products. Have a look at the comments. Chalo. For this, what we are going to do is, I'm going to, guys, 1 second. Huh? Okay. So, guys, for question 2, I'm not solving the question right now. I'm going to ask you to do it once on your own. So this will be a part of the sheet that I will be sharing after the class today. Tomorrow we'll do it together. So whatever we have learned in question 1, all the detailed steps and workings that we have done, I want you to apply it here. Do it once, attempt it. We in the next class, we'll do the question together. Okay? Now, how does the activity, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Now, something like this is often tested in MCQs. What kind of questions do they ask? Which two of the following are advantages of activity-based costing? Something like this. Basically, activity-based costing is far more scientific as compared to your traditional absorption costing. So it provides a better estimate of cost. It provides a better insight into what drives the overheads, what influences the overheads. It recognizes that basically, see, not all overheads are connected with production, and activity based costing accepts that fact, and activity based costing then uses that fact to have a better estimation of the cost. And it can be applied not just in production environments, but even in service industry such as mine, we can apply activity based costing. And basically it is a better estimator, so you can estimate your profits also better, and the accountability can be better defined, because if overhead costs are increasing, you will need to find out the specific area which is leading to such an increase in the overhead cost. And if you have activity based costing, ki is it the delivery cost which is more, is it the machining cost which is more, is it the component cost which is more, and then you can fix the responsibility and hold the person accountable. So activity based costing helps you with that as well. ABC will be of limited benefit if the overhead costs are primarily volume related, or if the overhead is a small proportion of the overall cost. See, if the overhead is a major component in the total cost structure, then the accuracy of that overhead matters more. If it is if the overhead cost is only 5% of the total cost, then even if the calculation is not that accurate, it is still okay. Because all the costing, any management accounting activity that you do, any financial reporting activity also that you do, basically it is governed by the cost benefit analysis, the benefit that you derive from doing a particular activity versus the cost that you incur for doing that particular activity. There is a correlation that is required between the two. If the cost of getting this detailed information is far more than the benefits you are getting from calculating the accurate cost, then probably don't do it. Which is why, if the overhead costs are a very small proportion of the total cost, uska, even if it is inaccurate, it is not very, very material to the overall decision making. In that case, activity based costing will not help. There is an MCQ based on this, by the way, in the kit on the study hub. The MCQ is something like ABC will be of limited benefit if the overhead costs are dash, a small proportion of overall cost, large proportion of overall cost on these lines. It is impossible to allocate all the overhead costs to specific activities, which you will see happening in question 2. For one part of the calculation, they will say use machine hours, because calculating or understanding what the cost driver is might not be the easiest activity of them all. Okay, ABC can be more complex to explain. Naturally, we took one entire class to discuss ABC, and the benefits might not justify the cost if it is extremely time consuming and too many minds are, applied to that particular activity. When government introduces austerity measures, there is an increased pressure on the government, pressure to deliver more with lesser resources at disposal. Now, what are austerity measures? Austerity is basically a period in which the government wants to control its spending. Okay, so let me write that down here. Austerity measures. This is basically controlling the government spending. Okay, a period when the government wants to control the overall spending. So with lesser resources, the government has to deliver more. Austerity, a word that characterizes severity or sternness, is used in economics to describe austerity measures, which is basically these are policies implemented by the government to reduce public sector debt by significantly curtailing government spending. जब government को अपना expenditure कम करना है, when the nation, when the country is in a difficult position, when the nation is in jeopardy of defaulting on its bonds. What does that mean? See, in our country as well, the government often raises money from the public by issue of government bonds. Okay, now if you remember, if you have ever studied financial management, wahan, there you will remember that the risk free rate is often used as the starting point for a lot of calculations. And usually the rate of interest on government bonds is considered to be the risk free rate. Why? Because the government bonds are assumed to be risk free. What do you mean by risk free? There is no risk of default. That is, you are not, your worry in case of debt instruments, your worry when you lend money to someone is that the person will not pay me back. In case of the government, that worry primarily is not there. It is assumed that the government will always pay you back. That is why the government bonds are considered risk free bonds, and that rate is called the risk free rate. Now, if the government itself does not have enough money, then there is a chance that the government might not be able to repay the bonds that it has, issued. In that case, the people, the population, they will lose faith in the government itself, and that will lead to collapse of the entire country. If that situation is approaching, then the government would want to reduce its spending. That is known as austerity measures. And in such situations where the responsibility on the public sector is more, in those cases the activity based costing will be a good way to control cost, because once you know the cost drivers, you will be able to understand which department is causing overspending. And once you know which department is causing overspending, naturally you will be able to fix the responsibility on that particular department and control the costs better. So again, activity-based costing is not something that you apply only in your retail businesses. It is something that you apply even in your wholesale, even at the government level also. So activity-based costing is far more scientific as compared to the traditional absorption costing methods. We have done one full length question. I'm giving you the other full length question as your homework. Attempt it, send it to me. Wherever you are getting stuck, regardless, we'll be doing the full question in the next class. Okay, so we'll stop here for today.